Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Venezuela Analysis podcast, where we answer your questions on everything Venezuela related. I'm Ryan Mallett-Outtrim, a staff writer here at VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and I've got my fellow staff writer, Lucas Koerner from Caracas, joining me today. How are you going today, Lucas?
I'm doing great, Ryan. How you doing?
I'm doing really good, actually. We've got a couple of questions from our readers today. The first one is from Ricardo Baz, who asks, what do you make of a recent Vatican-sponsored dialogue? And should we expect anything beyond the peaceful coexistence that is already in progress given the opposition's history? And also, should we take the opposition's decision to negotiate as a sign the government has managed to improve the situation or not? What's your take on this whole dialogue thing? Because as we were talking about before we got started, it's really complicated and there's a lot of interesting little details. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's first important to kind of give a little bit of context of where this dialogue came from. That, the government and the opposition have been trying to dialogue. There's been attempts by UNASUR, which is the Union of South American Nations, and then several ex-former presidents, including Jose Zapatero, the ex-president of Spain, to try to initiate a dialogue to break the very polarized political environment in Venezuela. And in June, there were some preliminary talks that kind of just flopped and didn't go anywhere. But the head of UNISOR wrote to the Pope to request that he mediate the dialogue, and I believe in September, he agreed to do so. So he sent an envoy who arrived at the end of October and, basically agreed to mediate talks between part of the opposition and the government. It's important also to know that this came right after a Supreme Court decision, or really local state courts deciding that the recall referendum that the opposition was pushing against the government had to be temporarily postponed, the next phase of signature collection, due to around 54,000 fraudulent signatures that were collected by the opposition, and they didn't vet, successfully. So that was a major blow to the opposition that thought that they would be able to convene this recall referendum against the president and, oust Maduro, perhaps, with new presidential elections this coming year. However, that does not seem to be the case, and some of the more extreme elements of the opposition have called for, much more to radicalize attackers to take to the streets until Maduro is ousted, which, we saw the similar thing in 2014. And they were violent protests, the same thing kind of violence we've seen in the last month, in which actually a police officer was killed on October 26th, among many other, public servants and, security of personnel injured, as well as public property destroyed. So basically, the story of this dialogue is the story of the increasing fracture of the Venezuelan opposition into two blocks that actually now have names. It's reached that point of division that you have one block that, from the very beginning of this dialogue at the very end of October, which was led by the Secretary General of the Opposition Coalition, Chuo Torrealba. And then you have several other parties, such as Acción Democrática, Primero Justicia, that jumped on board. And then you have 15 other parties that are now called the G15, led by the very far right Popular Will Party, led by the jailed Venezuelan politician Leopoldo Lopez, who was the mastermind, many people conclude, of the 2014 opposition protest that results in the death of 43 people. So you have this split within the opposition, with one side with these more moderate parties agreeing to enter into dialogue with the government, and now they've met two times and they've reached several agreements, which we can discuss. And then you have this other block of smaller parties and Voluntad Popular, who have refused to dialogue with the government and are now calling for increasing street protests and other types of radicalized tactics to force the fall of the government, which we know was democratically elected in 2013. So that's basically the kind of the backstory to this dialogue process. And where do we stand now? On this past weekend, these more moderate factions of the opposition that are engaging in dialogue agreed to five key agreements with the government. among them was a decision to recognize for the very first time the existence of an economic war against the Maduro government. And this is something that Maduro has been claiming, that private sector elements, which largely control the retail and distribution segments of the economy and the imports as well, basically, to overthrow him, to kind of a Chile style, make the economy scream so that Maduro loses all support and, he falls, which, has actually worked to some extent because they lost these landslide legislative elections last December that were largely a vote against the very difficult economic situation at this time. So this was a huge recognition by these parties that there was actually, it wasn't just the government's responsibility for the crisis, but clearly there was a part of sabotage, and these elements agreed to work with the government against that. We don't know what that means yet. But there was also other agreements, such as they agreed to suspend the Amazonas legislators who have been accused of electoral fraud until further investigations. It looks like new elections are going to take place. That also happened. And then the G15, the Popular Will Party and the other allied parties rejected that. And then, there's other measures like appointing new electoral officials and Supreme Court justices, et cetera. But that's not going to bore you with those details. But the key point here is there are two, the opposition is now, divided into two major camps. And in my view, I see that I wouldn't necessarily say it's a peaceful coexistence. I would say there are two different strategies for attempting to pursue the interests of Venezuela's elite, which is largely, represented by these right-wing parties. And, on the one hand, you have the more quote unquote moderate fractions, that are supporting this dialogue, and we don't know what the actual fine print of this dialogue is, but I would surmise that there are some major economic concessions that are going to be granted here to the private sector, perhaps a loosening of certain price controls, maybe something to do with exchange controls, that there's some kind of pact or, deal going on here. And that these sectors that they don't want to govern. They might not, want to govern right now, but they want to get, economic concessions from the government. And then you have this other more radicalized group, the G15, that they just want to overthrow the government and seize political power now and implement, whatever, the program that they want to implement, which is probably a very, harsh neoliberal program, the kind of thing that we saw in the 1980s in Venezuela that led to the 1989 Caracazo uprising. So, this, I would say, is where we stand with these two parts of the opposition. And, it's very volatile and very unstable. The opposition, has changed its position many, many times. And, we know that these different groups and figures hate each other, almost as much as they hate Maduro, or perhaps more. And, they have floated the idea of marching on Miraflores, and then they've taken it back. So it's a constantly, give and take. So that it's very unpredictable what the opposition is going to do. But clearly there seems to be a sector that has staked a lot of their political legitimacy on this. And, clearly there's political factors that have to do with, them doing this, because I would say that, people do not want the majority, over 80% of the Venezuelan population supports dialogue. And, that's very clear. People do not want violence. People do not want a civil war type scenario, which, obviously is very unlikely, but, violent attempts to overthrow the government increase that possibility. So, the majority of the population has shown that in recent polls, it has very little confidence in the opposition. They think they're very divided. They think they need to have new leaders, and they think that the opposition should help the government resolve the economic crisis in Venezuela. So I think the part of this opposition is kind of responding to that public opinion and trying to, perhaps, garner greater support by entering into dialogue, at least perhaps until Christmas, because really in Venezuela, everything shuts down around this time for Christmas, and you can't really, mobilize anyone or do anything. So meanwhile, this other faction perhaps is more, committed to being out in the cold and doing whatever it takes to overthrow the government in whatever time span. That's, I guess, the reading of the current balance of forces as I see them now.
Yeah, you make a really good point, by the way, by emphasizing how this has really divided the opposition, and how sometimes it seems like they almost hate each other more than they hate Maduro. I think one question that a lot of people have asked me is, how credible are these talks right now? the opposition will say, oh, well, the government's just biding for time. And the government will say, well, the opposition, or government supporters, I should say, will say that the opposition has this history of not engaging with talks sincerely. I don't know. I mean, reading the tea leaves a bit here, but what do you think? Do you think these seem like seriously credible talks, or do you think it's just politicking, just, it's just another way of fighting each other, or it's going to cave in, or something? I don't know. What's your take on it? Because I really don't know what to think at this point.
I mean, I think in a very perhaps, I would say superficial, but it's not superficial level. The fact that the Vatican is participating, in Venezuela, a very, very Catholic country in which, both sides have to at least pay lip service to the Catholic Church and, Catholicism in general. I think the fact that the symbolic weight of the Vatican's participation means that at least for the vast majority of the population, the talks acquire, certainly a serious veneer. Now, more deeply, I think that, the fact is, I would love to be a fly, in that room during those talks, to see what are the details being discussed there, and what was actually discussed when Thomas Shannon, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, when he came to Caracas the first week of November, and he met with Maduro and he met with the opposition. I would love to hear what they discussed. Obviously, we have no idea. So the details, my guess would be the fact that that we've seen two meetings in which, the opposition and the government have met face to face and have discussed, which has never happened, or has not happened at least since 2014, that they've actually, had a face to face meeting here and they've actually come to agreements. I mean, this is fairly unprecedented, but there clearly has to be something of substance being discussed here. And, I think that it's clear, from the government's, standpoint that, there's a necessity to, solicit the support of the private sector to solve this economic crisis. I mean, we have to look at, the way Venezuela is suffering this crisis, which is not unique to Venezuela. I mean, we can look at Iran, we can look at Russia, we can look at Nigeria, we can look at many other oil producing countries that have, including Saudi Arabia, that have been hit hard by this collapse of oil prices. Yet they are not in any way in the same situation as Venezuela. And of course, the opposition responds to that and says, oh, well, it's the government's, incompetence that has led to this. And, I think that obviously there's definitely a lot of ineptness in the government's economic administration, and the total incapacity or lack of will to take any real economic measures that could, for example, maybe unifying the multiple exchange rates that just have failed over the past, 3 years to, the dollar has been shooting up. The lack of political will to take these steps, for, fear of losing votes. Obviously the government is completely culpable of that. But I think that there's more to the story than that. And to reduce it to that is very disingenuous. That clearly when we look at the bond markets and Venezuela's debt, and we see that the ratings agencies, value Venezuela's debt with a very, very high risk, which is very, very strange given that Venezuela has a almost impeccable record of paying its foreign debt, as it just did last month when it just put down another $1 billion in debt payments, bond payments. So I think that there's clearly, the ex Merrill Lynch Bank of America economist Francisco Rodriguez, he has, explicitly told Telesur in a recent piece that, these kinds of decisions of whether to lend to, huge lending decisions, for example, when when Citibank just refused to continue playing the role of Venezuela's bond agent. That is, they receives money from Venezuela's reserves in order to pay, bondholders. This is unprecedented. This almost never happens, and this is clearly, these kinds of decisions are definitely influenced by the United States. When the United States declares, the government, Venezuela, a unusual and extraordinary threat, when it applies sanctions to top officials. I mean, these are moves that have real economic repercussions, even without there being, explicitly economic sanctions. So, there definitely is a dimension that the private sector in Venezuela has not stopped trying to sabotage this government and overthrow it, since, Chavez came to power, but particularly, with the most, glaring case of this being the 2003, late 2000, December 2002, early 2003, general strike, oil strike, in which they basically attempted to shut down and strangle the entire economy. So I do think that we are seeing something, much more low intensity, but, with, catastrophic results that, simply there's an investment strike. There's no will to lend to Venezuela. Any of the other countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, they can get loans, to weather this crisis, but Venezuela is not, being lent to. So I think, and its terms of repayment of its debt is not up for renegotiation. So these are clear, so I do think that there are details that are key economic details that are being discussed. Because the government things cannot go on this way. I mean, the government has to secure some kind of, private sector participation in order, to get credit, in order to, get the private sector to invest again, in order to, to produce at least, some basic things that are produced in Venezuela. For example, the Polar company, which is the largest food producer. It's not even actually a food producer. It's more of a food assembler because it imports all the raw materials and it assembles them. It produces corn flour, the most important, the base of the Venezuelan diet. It has received billions of dollars in state funds, yet you can't find harina pan anywhere. Clearly this is a result of, this company is deciding not to produce. So there, clearly there's an attempt to negotiate this. We're going to see on what terms are the negotiations. Are these terms that could favor the vast majority of Venezuelans, like i.e., lowering inflation, increasing access to basic products, et cetera? Or are these neoliberal terms in which the government is basically conceding, is selling out, and is just going to, yeah, sure, like in the 1990s, supermarkets will be full again, and this is actually already happening in Venezuela. All these products that disappeared for 2 years are coming back, but they're very expensive. So this is the question. This is the question of class struggle. That on what terms is this crisis going to be resolved? And I think that we need to be paying a lot of attention right now.
Yeah, I just want to point out, by the way, you totally can get Polar corn flour on supermarket shelves. You can totally see it, just not in Venezuela.
Exactly.
I saw it in Ecuador, I think it was. People said they saw it in the States even. So it's just not in Venezuela.
And this is actually something really interesting that you point out, that, Polar, like there's a whole myth, the mythology of Polar is that it's a national company, that it has basically appropriated of the national image, and that, for example, the product corn flour in Venezuela is called harina pan. It's basically, the brand name, it stands for the name of the product as such, and this is completely, they've created this whole national image, for Venezuela. And, the fact is there's nothing national about Polar. It's a transnational company. The transnational companies have large stakes there. They don't produce anything in Venezuela. They import all the raw materials. And in fact, the same thing when I'm in the United States, you can buy harina pan over there, and it's all made in the United States. So the same thing in Spain. I'm not sure if it's made in Spain, but it's clearly this is a transnational company, and this is part of the problem, that Venezuela, its people and its government are just victim to this encirclement by these large transnational firms on whom it depends for basically to eat, because Venezuela doesn't produce enough to feed itself. So when Venezuela you have these massive looming deadlines for billions in debt payments, and you have a choice. Are you going to not pay your debt, and then they're going to confiscate PDVSA's assets, and they're going to start implementing, that's obviously, the creditors are going to respond with vengeance for that. Or so do you do not do that, or do you cut your food imports? And that's what they've been doing. They've massively cut I think they just came out that food imports this year have been cut by around 40%, which is
it's enormous.
And, obviously it's completely fucked up on a lot of levels. But, the question is, what choice is there when you're a country that, imported, when we're looking at the height of the oil bonanza, that imported, I think, what was it during the statistic was when Venezuela, at the height of the oil bonanza, Venezuela was the largest net, importer of scotch in the world. I mean, it was just it was ridiculous that it had reached that level. So, I mean, clearly there's a process of accommodation there, but the question is again on what terms that we have to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, we're actually running a bit low on time now, and we just got one more question that I wanted to throw at you. This one's from Macdonald Stainsby, who asked, what are some of the grassroots demands and proposals that are going unheeded or, I guess, ignored maybe? This is a really good question. What's your take? What do you think? What sort of demands do you think the grassroots are giving that maybe we're not hearing about or are otherwise going unheeded in Venezuela right now? I think there's probably quite a few of them, to be honest, but I don't know, maybe just the one or two most important ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important, I think among, the bases of Chavismo in general, there's the general sentiment is that the government needs to take urgent steps to resolve the economic crisis. And, so in general, and of course there's different, there's a lot of different tendencies that have a lot of different solutions. But I do think that in a general sense, I think there's a consensus that the government needs to tackle corruption, that there has been no serious attempts at going after corruption under Maduro at all. And that it's really a problem, when you see that earlier this year, we just saw this week, in fact, that that a number of top food ministry officials, that, for example, the president of Venezuela's Bastos Bicentenario supermarket chain, and then of the Venezuelan Food Corporation, these people are going to trial for corruption. However, the food minister at the time, Carlos Osorio, who is also a very important general, is not, is untouchable. He's not facing any charges over this. So I mean, so there's a very deep corruption problem that, is nothing new in Venezuela because, the very structure of the Venezuelan petrostate is basically whoever controls the government controls the oil revenue and, enriches themselves in some way. Basically you have, allegations, and you have reports that have, argued and sought to show that some $200-300 billion of state funds have disappeared over the course of Chavismo's administration. So, I mean, this is a very real problem, and the masses of people want to see these kinds of bureaucrats who, are enriching themselves at the expense of the masses of the people, to be, put in jail. So I would say that's definitely a transversal demand. I mean, I would say that there's other, key demands. For example, like there's measures I think that the government could take and many people think they could take, like increasing the price of gasoline, because the vast majority, Venezuela has, the lowest gasoline prices in the world. And this acts as a subsidy to middle class Venezuelans because the vast majority of the poor do not have cars.
Right.
So they could increase, consumer gasoline prices. And this would be, a very, a timely measure, and it could increase state revenue. So I think that's, definitely a demand. And then, I think there's also demands around, the question of, how does, Venezuela's importer economy work? I mean, basically, for over a decade, Venezuela, the state has basically thrown billions of petrodollar at private, importers, so that they can, import the things Venezuela needs. Of course, these importers have basically committed fraud in numerous ways, as I mentioned, with a $200-300 billion figure that, basically saying that they were going to import something and not importing anything, or importing an inferior product, or, whatever, or just, the numbers we can discuss are absolutely astronomical with I think the price of pharmaceuticals increasing by, like 200, Venezuela spending like 200% more over a decade on pharmaceuticals. I mean, clearly there's a process of trying to cheat the state. So I think that there's definitely a sentiment that, the government needs to tackle corruption, but also needs to assert itself vis-a-vis, the transnational corporations, the private sector, and, kind of end this, process of just throwing money at them in return for imports, and, perhaps attempting to nationalize the import, nationalize the import sector and nationalize the, retail sector, trying to assert a state presence there. I mean, obviously, these are very complicated because the state capacity of Venezuela has always been very weak. so it's always a problem with the Venezuelan state attempting to, that doesn't have necessarily the technical capacity to just move in and administer large segments of the economy, unlike, for example, a state, in the global north, which clearly, the Venezuelan state is much smaller than France's, despite all of this, notion of Venezuela being a socialist, state, which is not, Venezuela, it's a very small state with very limited capacity, and it really is unable to administer vast sections of the economy. But I think that there's a general sentiment that trying to strike a better deal with, transnational capital and, trying to radicalize the process, where it can. I think this is also the last point that I want to make, that, particularly for, the left wing of Chavismo that, who swear by Chavez's last speech, strike at the helm, golpe de timon, comuna o nada, commune or nothing. And this, Venezuela, the government really needs to push forward the initiative to develop communes, which are basically, large, networks of communal councils that are directly organized from below by communities, and involve not only just direct democracy and regional territorial administration from below, but also production. That you have socially owned enterprises, and these are actually, in some areas, are becoming increasingly significant economically in being able to feed growing numbers of people. So these kind of solutions, that certainly trying to confront transnational capital is key, but also trying to back efforts from grassroots efforts to create alternatives is a necessity, because over time, Venezuela cannot continue to depend, to the extent that it does depend on oil revenue. Then, this crisis illustrates that that's absolutely untenable. And we'll see to what extent, these forces can, in the next months and years kind of, strengthen themselves to push in that direction.
All right. Yeah, definitely. Definitely, I think you make a really good point in terms of referencing Chavez's last speech, striking at the helm, because every time Maduro does take serious action on something, that's when his approval ratings go up. Like, I think his highest approval ratings were back in late 2013, when he was basically presiding over a huge crackdown on price gouging. And obviously the international media went nuts over it. Seeing the army, or the National Guard, coming in and basically forcing large shops to sell things at reasonable prices instead of these huge speculative prices. The right wing went crazy over it, but Maduro's support went through the roof. And I think this is when he was the most popular, he's been. I don't think, at least he certainly hasn't been that popular since. So definitely you're right. But when Maduro actually takes like a serious, strong action on something, especially if it was something, say, like corruption or price gouging, or just trying to get a better deal for people from some of these large corporations, that's when he's popular, that's when he's safe. And just not doing anything, which I think is something that he's done a bit of lately, just being a little bit too passive, especially leading up to last year's December 2015 election, people think it's the safe option, but it's really not.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And, I think it's interesting to point out that, one of the government's initiatives in response to the failure, to the defeat of December 6, 2015, was precisely to launch these local production provision committees called the CLAPs, with the idea of trying to distribute food locally directly to communal councils, who can in turn distribute them house to house to their residents on the basis of census, et cetera. That, and this is, an extremely uneven program, that, certainly has some areas benefiting more than others. But, there has been, some polling data has shown that it has been somewhat effective, at least, in alleviating, access to some, basic needs of, key products such as cooking oil and corn flour and chicken, et cetera. I would say that, I've only participated in one of these, one time. So, and I think they're very infrequent, perhaps, they're supposed to be every few weeks, but sometimes every month, sometimes every 6 weeks. So it's really, and, part of the problem, it's been critiqued on the left that, it's not, as you can read in the most recent analysis piece we put out for Venezuela Analysis, that it does not prioritize kind of grassroots democracy. It tries to replicate more of a top-down structure, which isn't, particularly helpful in trying to push forward with the, self-declared aims of, of Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution, of, protagonist and participatory democracy. So, I think that it's definitely, we could say that it's definitely a factor to some degree in perhaps increasing Maduro's popularity in this moment, though it should be definitely taken with a very massive grain of salt.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us today. I've kept you way longer than I said I would. But it's a really interesting conversation. And thanks so much also to Ricardo Vaz and Macdonald Stainsby for your really thought-provoking questions. Thanks a lot. And obviously, everyone make sure to go and check out VenezuelaAnalysis.com for all the latest news on Venezuela. And of course, all the best analysis and opinion pieces on the current situation in Venezuela, including the one that Lucas just mentioned on the collapse. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks so much, Lucas. I'll see you around.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. See you later, man.